I decided to hike alone on a trail I'd walked many times before. I knew the route well, or so I thought. The day started off sunny and clear, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, clouds began to gather. I wasn't too worried. After all, I had my map, a flashlight, and plenty of supplies. As the afternoon turned to evening, the sky darkened quickly. The once familiar trail now seemed different, more twisted and overgrown. I checked my map and compass, but nothing seemed to match up. The trees grew denser, blocking out most of the remaining light. My gut feeling told me to head back, but I convinced myself that I could find my way. The shadows grew longer, and soon it was dark. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing a path I didn't remember. My heart pounded as the forest seemed to close in around me. The air was getting colder, and I began to hear strange sounds, whispers and shuffling noises that seemed to come from all directions. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the forest settling for the night. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a man's scream. It was raw and desperate, filled with pain. The sound was so chilling that I froze in place. It was followed by another scream, one that sounded like someone was being tortured, a heart-wrenching, agonized wail that seemed to echo through the trees. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the screams, but all I saw were dark, moving shadows. The forest seemed alive with unsettling noises, groans, hiccup-like sounds, and more distant screams. The noises were becoming more frequent and intense, like a nightmarish symphony. I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find the source of the screams. As I moved, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. I felt as though I was being watched. The flashlight flickered erratically, and my breaths came in quick, shallow gasps. Finally, I reached a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin at its center. It looked ancient and decayed, with broken windows and an overgrown yard. The door hung loosely on its hinges. The screams seemed to be coming from inside. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but I knew I had to investigate. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of decay. My flashlight illuminated old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls were stained, and there was a strange, metallic scent in the air. I stepped carefully, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The screams were now more distinct, coming from below. I found a trapdoor in the corner of the room. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The screams were louder now, mingled with muffled, incoherent noises that sounded like someone hiccuping or gasping in distress. I descended the stairs, each step feeling like it took me deeper into a nightmare. The basement was dimly lit by a flickering light bulb. In the center of the room, I saw a figure tied to a chair, covered in blood. His face was contorted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. He was the source of the tortured screams. The man looked up at me, his eyes pleading for help. His voice was hoarse, and he tried to speak, but only choked cries came out. The sight was horrifying. His clothes were torn, and the blood was smeared all over the floor. It was clear that he had been tortured. I wanted to help him, but I was frozen in terror. Suddenly, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The screams and hiccup-like gasps continued, but the shadows seemed to move, and the room felt colder. I could hear footsteps approaching, and I wasn't alone anymore. In the dark, I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I could hear whispers growing louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The basement seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The man's screams grew more frantic, and I could hear a low, grating laugh that sent chills down my spine. I made a desperate decision to leave. I ran up the stairs, stumbling in the dark, the cold air biting at my skin. As I reached the top, I glanced back one last time. The figure was still there, screaming, and the shadows seemed to reach out for me. I threw open the trapdoor and bolted out of the cabin, racing through the forest. The forest was just as dark and twisted as before, but I ran blindly, driven by sheer terror. I could still hear the man's screams echoing in my ears. my flashlight finally flickered back on, and I used it to find my way. The forest seemed to shift and change, but I pushed through, guided by the faintest glimmers of hope. After what felt like hours of running, I finally found a familiar trail. I stumbled onto a road, where a passing car stopped to help me. I was exhausted and shaking, and I could barely speak as I described what I had seen. The police and search teams investigated the area, but they found nothing. The cabin was gone, and there were no traces of the man. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything up, erasing it from existence. To this day, I can't forget the sound of those tortured screams and the eerie whispers in the dark. The forest has always felt different to me since that night, and I can't shake the feeling that something dark and malevolent still lingers in the shadows. It started as a fun idea. My friends and I decided to hike a new trail through the forest. None of us had been there before, but it looked like an adventure. We had our backpacks packed with snacks, water, and a couple of flashlights. The weather was perfect, and we set off with high spirits, joking and laughing as we walked. The trail was beautiful at first. Tall trees with thick canopies, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze, cast dappled shadows on the ground. We followed the path, taking turns leading and letting the conversation flow freely. As the afternoon wore on, we noticed the sun beginning to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in hues of gold and orange. We should have turned back when we noticed how the light was fading, but we were having too much fun to stop. Besides, we told ourselves, we had plenty of time. Eventually, though, the forest began to look unfamiliar. The path, which had been clear and well-trodden, started to disappear into underbrush and tangled vines. The shadows lengthened, and the once friendly forest seemed to grow darker and more foreboding. It wasn't long before we realized that we were lost. The trees that had been our guideposts were now indistinguishable from one another. Our attempts to retrace our steps only led us deeper into the woods. The laughter and lightheartedness turned into anxiety and nervous glances. As night fell, the forest transformed into a place of dark silhouettes and whispering winds. Our flashlights barely pierced the gloom, casting eerie shadows that danced around us. We tried calling for help, but our phones had no signal. The silence of the forest grew deeper, broken only by the occasional rustle or snap of a twig underfoot. Then we started hearing whispers. At first, we thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as it grew louder, the whispers seemed to form words. They sounded like distant voices, and they were calling our names. Lisa. Dave, come here. The whispers were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were definitely there. We stopped in our tracks, listening. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more insistent. Fear tightened around our chests as we realized that the voices were coming closer. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, I hear it too," Dave replied, trying to sound calm but failing. The forest seemed to close in on us. The trees, now twisted and gnarled in the dim light, looked like dark, menacing figures. Our flashlights flickered as if protesting against the encroaching darkness. Shadows moved around us, shifting and changing as if they had a life of their own. We huddled together, trying to stay calm and make a plan. Our original plan to stay together and find a way out quickly fell apart. The whispers grew more urgent, and it felt as though we were being herded deeper into the woods. The path we had been following now seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, leading us further from where we needed to go. Panic set in as we stumbled over roots and rocks, our breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The voices grew louder, more frantic. They seemed to be pleading with us, calling us towards something. We tried to ignore them, but it was impossible to escape the feeling that something was watching us, something malevolent. At one point, we found a small clearing with a stone circle in the middle. The stones were old and weathered, and they looked out of place in the forest. The whispers grew more intense as we approached the stones, becoming almost frantic. "Is this some kind of ritual site?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Dave said, "but we need to get out of here." We turned to leave, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. The trees shifted and blocked our way. We were surrounded, and the whispers had turned into desperate screams, echoing in our ears. We could barely see each other in the darkness, and the path ahead was shrouded in impenetrable blackness. "Where are we?" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Stay close," Dave ordered, grabbing her hand. We stumbled through the dark, our hearts pounding. The forest was alive with movement, branches swaying, shadows darting. The air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to wrap around us, pulling us in different directions. We tried to keep our bearings, but it felt like the forest itself was alive, shifting and moving to keep us lost. We were exhausted, cold, and scared. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, all shouting and screaming, making it impossible to think clearly. Just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, the forest seemed to open up, and we stumbled into a large, dark pit. We peered over the edge, but the darkness below was impenetrable. The whispers turned into an eerie, echoing chant that seemed to come from the depths of the pit. With no other options, we backed away, our desperation growing. We knew we had to keep moving, but every step felt like it was taking us deeper into the nightmare. Finally, as we were on the brink of losing hope, we saw a faint light in the distance. It was distant and flickering, but it was a beacon of hope. We made our way towards it, fighting through the forest's darkness. The whispers grew fainter, and the path seemed to clear. As we reached the edge of the forest, we finally saw the headlights of a car. We stumbled out onto the road, breathless and shaken. The car stopped, and a driver got out, looking at us with concern. We didn't stop to explain, we just climbed into the car, relieved and exhausted. As the forest receded into the distance, we looked back, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. We had escaped, but the memory of those whispers in the dark forest would haunt us for a long time to come. My brother Alex and I were looking for a new hiking adventure when we stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail. We had heard rumors about this trail, people said it led to an abandoned cabin, but no one we knew had actually been there. We were excited by the mystery and decided to check it out. The trail started off pretty well, with tall trees and soft, crunchy leaves underfoot. The forest was dense, but the path was clear enough to follow. We chatted and joked as we walked, enjoying the thrill of exploring somewhere new. As the sun dipped lower, the light started to fade, but we pressed on, eager to find the cabin. After a couple of hours, we saw it, a rickety old cabin hidden deep in the woods. Its wooden walls were gray and covered in vines, and its roof was sagging. It looked like something out of a ghost story, but we were intrigued. "Let's check it out," Alex said with a grin, pushing open the creaky door. The inside was dark and musty. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. We shone our flashlights around, revealing cobwebs in every corner and old, broken furniture. As we explored, we heard strange noises coming from beneath the floor. It sounded like scratching or scraping, but we couldn't figure out what it was. Alex was excited and started investigating the noises, but I felt uneasy. Just as we were about to leave, the floorboards under our feet shifted with a loud crack. The room felt colder, and the scratching noises grew louder. I looked at Alex, and his face was pale, his excitement fading into fear. We decided to leave, but when we tried to open the door, it was jammed. "What the hell?" Alex said, pulling at the door. It wouldn't budge. We tried pushing and pulling, but it was as if something was holding it shut. Suddenly, the scratching noise stopped, and there was a new sound, a low, grating voice, coming from beneath the cabin. It was barely audible, but it sounded like a chant or a plea. The cabin seemed to grow darker, and the temperature dropped sharply. We could see our breaths in the air. In a panic, Alex grabbed a piece of wood and tried to pry the door open. As he struggled, I noticed a trickle of blood running from a crack in the floor. It started as a thin line, but soon it was pooling around our feet. "What is that?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Alex stopped his efforts and looked down. His face turned even whiter as he saw the blood. The floorboards under us began to creak and shift, and the blood spread faster. The grating voice grew louder, filling the cabin with a chilling sound. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to stay calm. Alex and I tried to find another way out, but every corner of the cabin seemed to close in on us. The air was thick with a metallic smell, and the blood continued to seep through the floorboards. The whispers beneath the cabin turned into loud, desperate screams. As we were about to give up hope, Alex noticed a small window near the ceiling. It was covered with grime and cobwebs, but we might be able to squeeze through. He boosted me up, and I managed to push the window open. "I'm out," I called, looking down at Alex. He tried to climb up, but as he did, the floorboards gave way. The blood surged, and the cabin seemed to come alive with a sinister energy. I reached down to pull him out, but the darkness from below grabbed at him. "No!" I screamed, trying to pull him up, but the force was too strong. Alex's screams were swallowed by the darkness, and I could only watch in horror as he disappeared into the gaping hole beneath the cabin. I scrambled out of the window, falling onto the ground outside. I turned to look at the cabin one last time, but it was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I ran, not daring to look back. The forest seemed endless, the trees and shadows closing in on me. I stumbled and tripped, but I kept going, driven by sheer terror. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged onto a familiar trail. I collapsed, crying and shaking, and eventually, a hiker passing by found me and helped me get back to safety. The police and search teams came later, but they found no trace of the cabin or Alex. It was as if the forest had erased it from existence. The only thing I had left were my memories of that night, of the blood, the whispers, and my brother's terrified screams. To this day, I wonder what happened in that cabin. The forest has never been the same for me, and every time I see an old, abandoned building, I shudder, remembering the night when my brother and I ventured too far into the unknown.